Good afternoon, and welcome to my office for the second sermon in the series of Advent sermons for 2018. We're doing it this way because of the snowpocalypse that hit us over the weekend, and that kind of knocked out my internet and made loading it impossible. So I apologize for the delay in getting it to you, but I wanted us to be able to have that sermon because of the series of studies that we have for Advent for this year. So I'm including this sermon so that you've got it. The sermon series this year is on the names that Isaiah uses to describe the Messiah as the child born to us. And this is the second sermon, so we're looking today at the second name, Mighty God. These names are all amazing names. Wonderful Counselor, Everlasting Father, they're all wonderful. But this is probably the most surprising of all, particularly to ancient Jews. Isaiah's promise in this passage seems to demand that we understand that the one to come would be none other than God himself. Last week we looked at the darkness, primarily as it relates to our personal struggles, and how a counselor can step into that darkness, if we let them, and help us there, so that a counselor can come alongside us and help us with our family problems, or our marital problems, or our problems in life, or our problems in making decisions. But at the scale of the problems that Isaiah seems to suggest that this one who was to be born was expected to take on, if you look at the passage, just look at these. These aren't just personal problems and family struggles, although I don't think that we were wrong to think of the counselor helping us in terms of those things. But Isaiah's words promise that God, this person, will deal with things like expanding the joy of the nation and the end of oppression and breaking the oppressor's rod. And then he makes this amazing statement. Every boot of the trampling warrior and every garment rolled in blood will be burned as fuel for the fire, which seems to suggest the end of war. Like altogether, the end of it. Like there's no more war. Who can accomplish a thing like that? The surprising thing is that the one to come is called Mighty God, and surely if this son born to us is going to accomplish all this, he's going to need to be God, because these are God-sized problems. But how can this be? We take it so for granted that we may not notice just how strange and perplexing a claim that this is, that God would be born as a child. This really is the most startling of the names that Isaiah uses, particularly for those radically monotheistic, the Jews, those who heard him. How could our mighty God possibly be born among us as a human son? And yet, we just accept it because it's at the center of our faith. We're familiar with it, so it doesn't startle us unless we think about it. I think the first thing that we have to think about when we're thinking about it is that this guy, this person who grew up from that son born, is so startlingly human. If you look at the way that he's treated and presented by the Gospels, he is very clearly a man. He does things like going to dinner parties and eating with people over and over and over again. And you also get to see him doing things like getting thirsty and asking for help, sitting on the side of the well with that woman who walked up, and he's not supposed to talk to her, but he does talk to her. He's so human in his need for assistance, because as she points out, where are you going to get water? You've got nothing to draw with and the well is deep. He needed her help and he asked for it. No doubt this guy sometimes smelled like sweat, and he laughed, and he was frustrated. There are times when he's exhausted and just wants to get away, and he's so remarkably human. And yet the Gospels also present him with startling divinity all around him. For instance, there's the time when he's in the boat, and notice him there in that picture. He's down there in the corner asleep. But just imagine being in that boat, and you're Matthew in those wild and rocking waves, and you're looking at Peter and at John, who are both fishermen, and their brothers who are fishermen, and you're thinking, okay, they look genuinely afraid. And if those guys are afraid, we really are in trouble here. And yet, when the Messiah stands up, he says, "Peace, be still." And the elements surrender to him. He demonstrates that he is in absolute control over the elements. Or, of course, there's another time with another boat story where he comes walking out to them on the water, the way Yahweh marches upon the waves. Or in another example, there's a time when that young boy comes to them with very little food, and Jesus is saying, "You feed these 5,000 people." And then he prays, and then he feeds them in the wilderness. Feeds them with bread that clearly came from that boy, but also clearly came from divine power, came from heaven. The way that God fed them in the wilderness with bread that they hadn't known. There is the repeated demonstrations that he is stronger than illness. He goes and touches the ears of the deaf and they hear, the eyes of the blind. He spits in the ground and he puts mud on them and they wash it off and they can see. He lifts the lame from the ground. He touches the leper and they get well. He does this again and again and again, demonstrating a great power of divinity as a healer and the ability to drive away our sicknesses. And of course, the ultimate sickness is death. And yet he stands outside of Lazarus's tomb and demonstrates that he is, in fact, the resurrection by leading Lazarus out of his tomb and unwinding him from unnecessary grave clothes. Who is this guy? The way they asked when they were in the boat, who is this that even the winds and the waves obey him? Even death obeys him. And even the forces of evil, because we see this guy going toe to toe with that great dark angel, Satan himself, the fallen one who brought down others with him. We see him being able to stand up to Satan. Can you do that? Can anyone do that? And not just Satan, but all of the forces of evil. They cower before him. They are afraid of him. And of course, this one did what only our mighty God can do. He rescued us from sin by taking upon himself every bit of the just penalty for sin that was yours and was mine. He suffered it for us, and then he left it behind. When he walked out of the tomb, our sin stayed buried. This one does what only God can do. He is our mighty God. Well, now it's worth asking, so what? So what difference does all that make? Well, let me ask you, what trouble do you face that God can't handle? And let's think about what he has demonstrated through he's demonstrated that he is God through all of his miracles, but also each of those miracles demonstrates that he is God for us in a particular and specific place and way. For instance, his dominion over the elements demonstrates that we live in a cursed earth and a chaotic one that is filled with problem and trouble. And there's plenty of reason to be afraid, but the problems that we face in living in a chaotic world can be safely entrusted to him. We don't have to be afraid. His ability to provide for the thousands in the wilderness is a demonstration that as God, he is also a provisional God. He wants to take care of us. He can supply us with what we need. So our economic and our resource worries, we don't have to be afraid. We can trust him. He will care for us. His ability to heal means that sickness does not have to overwhelm us. We can trust him with those things. The fact that he is stronger than evil means that he is able to defend us both from unseen and visible forces of evil, meaning that both the unjust human beings and the evil forces of government or economics or business people who would try to take advantage of us, we can trust him to defend us from those, and certainly from the forces of Satan and all the black armies that would kill us all. He will protect us and defend us, and he is the defeater of death. Death itself, we can die knowing that he has promised to overcome death, and he has demonstrated it. And our rescue from sin that we have received, that is a rescue from sin and from death, and he has demonstrated that God intends to do it because he did it for him. We are delivered from all of our sins, our failures, and we are rescued by our mighty God. For unto us a child is born. Unto us a son is given, and the government shall be upon his shoulder, and his name shall be called Wonderful Counselor, Mighty God, Everlasting Father, Prince of Peace. Church, rejoice. The promised child has come, and the Son born to us is our mighty God.